Final Fantasy XIV's first graphical overhaul since the release of version 2.0 in 2013 was likely the most anticipated feature of version 7.0, aside from the new story, locations, and job classes that came with Dawntrail, the game's 5th expansion. And now that it's been released for a bit, I've of course been excitedly poking around to see just what kind of leap we've got on our hands here. And given the range of hardware that the game remains playable on, what the trade-offs are. Some aspects are clearly better than they used to be, some are up to debate, and some features are possibly not working quite as intended. For those concerned with spoilers, don't worry. I've hidden the dialogue and all cutscene recordings, and as far as Dawntrail content goes, I'll just be showing the new hub city of Tuliyollal and bits of the locations that open up in the first half of the story. Dawntrail is worth a look due to its assets being designed exclusively for version 7.0, but this isn't so much a Dawntrail review as it is a look at what has changed, so most comparisons are based around changes in older content. And as the characters in the game would say, there is much and more to discuss. A number of core upgrades to the technical makeup of Final Fantasy XIV has impacted the visual experience to greater and lesser degrees throughout the entire game, regardless of how new or old each location may be. In addition, a smattering of improved modeling, shaders, and updated texture work across characters and environments has been implemented, but development staff have emphasized that it was not feasible to fully touch up all old assets ahead of version 7.0, so some aspects may yet get further enhancements in the near or less near future. To get an idea of the full extent of version 7.0's graphics update, I prepared a bunch of shots ahead of time from version 6.58 running on Windows at 2160p with maximum settings, with one exception. I strongly dislike the PC version's HBAO Plus settings for ambient occlusion, which erase and draw in shading rather distractingly when occluded and disoccluded by characters and other objects, as well as at the edges of the screen. Thus, my otherwise max settings version 6.58 footage uses a more basic SSAO setting, which even though it adds very little to the image, I do prefer it over occlusion artifacts. The light SSAO setting also seemed to match parameters used by the console versions prior to 7.0. So while many may disagree with my choice here, I decided to err on the side of personal preference and parity with the console versions in terms of how to represent ambient occlusion on the pre-update PC version. So because of this, even though it's not a headline feature, I think the best place to start in establishing the visual differences between the old and new versions is with ambient occlusion. The old settings on PC remain alongside the new GTAO, Ground Truth Ambient Occlusion, which can be chosen in standard and quality flavors. This is a major change for the game as the current gen console versions have adopted the equivalent of the GTAO standard setting as their sole mode of ambient occlusion. As ambient occlusion is wont to do, GTAO adds shading to crevices and under objects and such, but the GTAO quality setting certainly has a broader impact across affected surfaces. While both GTAO standard and quality manage to touch up areas that would be a bit glowy without ambient occlusion, the standard setting certainly misses a few spots that the quality option can fill in. GTAO quality does more to fill in spots that should be shaded than HBAO Plus quality. See the spaces under and between the desks here, while also doing a better job at staying out of places it has no business being, like how HBAO Plus is making overly dark outlines in the crevices along the back wall. So, GTAO quality is clearly the game's most advanced and comprehensive AO mode to date, but it is still a screen space technique, and as such, the wider reach of the effect opens up more opportunities for more noticeable occlusion artifacts. There are plenty of places where it feels like GTAO quality is trying to do too much, and draws in and out all over the edges of the screen, as well as when occluded by characters and other objects and structures in the environment. Though they all have issues, among the 4HBAO Plus and GTAO modes, I feel that GTAO Standard does the best job of remaining visually stable when occluded and having less distracting issues at the edges of the screen, while still giving new depth to the image, especially on consoles. So, on balance, I feel that the right call was made in using GTAO Standard on consoles instead of Quality because it's less prone to artifacts, making it the safer choice, one that shouldn't annoy very many players. However, for better or worse, PS4 does not get GTAO, and still uses the older basic SSAO, which isn't much different than no AO at all. So, since we've now established that the GTAO quality setting on PC can be more striking than GTAO Standard, albeit with a higher risk of artifacts, I've decided to stick to my prior logic of erring on the side of less artifacty console equivalent ambient occlusion is the baseline for the PC version in shots going forward, but with otherwise max settings unless otherwise noted. So that's GTAO Standard in the new footage, and I think it's doing a great job here. If you're playing on PC and aren't annoyed by bits of weirdness along the edges and a bit of glow as your character passes over some of the shading, then please do enjoy GTAO quality. It looks excellent otherwise. While we're in the realm of shading, let's talk about shadows. On the face of it, very little has changed in terms of new shadow settings on PC. The maximum shadow resolution, 2048p, hasn't increased at all, but the perceptual quality of shadows has been greatly enhanced thanks to the new strongest setting for shadow softening. I generally prefer softer shadows regardless of resolution, so this is a massive improvement in my opinion over the previous maximum of strong, which is itself not that huge of a jump over the weak shadow softening setting. The limitations of the maximum shadow resolution are still apparent at certain angles, but most of the time shadow maps can now look far more respectable than they used to. I think tree branches and leaves can now cast very pleasing soft shadows, whereas before, the shadows under the canopies looked pretty junky. The same quality of softened shadows carries over to PS5 and Series X as well, making this one of the most impactful visual improvements for players on the most powerful current-gen consoles. This new tier of shadow softening also grants the shadow of your own character and mount simulated variable penumbra, where the parts of the shadow cast from the higher parts of your body are more diffuse compared to the hard-edged shadows at your feet. There is a really strange issue with these new soft shadows, however, which occurs on PC, PS5, and Series X. In any given location, the degree of shadow diffusion changes depending on what direction the camera is pointed. This isn't about camera distance from the shadow, it's about where the camera is facing. Pointed one way, very soft shadows. Pointed another way, those same shadows become less soft. Watch how the shadow softness varies as I raise the camera here, and then as I rotate it overhead. Surely this isn't the intended behavior. Due to this variability, the line where the shadow cascade shifts between levels of quality can be distractingly visible at certain angles, and not bad at all at other angles. The highest shadow cascade setting on PC that's also used on PS5 and Series X is not enough to cast shadows all the way to the farthest reaches of the zone, but this is rarely noticeable. This is just an extreme scenario from an elevated height where you can see unusually far across a barren landscape bordered by shadow casting cliffsides. And there can still be some nasty shadows in spots, such as where light hits stairs at sharp angles, and yes, on characters' faces in cutscenes and in gameplay, which remains a sore point. Shadows from secondary light sources remain especially blocky at times, and may be seen more often due to the increased light sources in 7.0. Series S and PS4 unfortunately remain lacking in the shadow quality department. Even though they too get the highest resolution shadows, their settings for shadow cascading and shadow softening are more akin to the PC version's middle tiers, resulting in more jagged shadows and reduced shadow draw distance. Although some may prefer the sharper shadows, especially given the inconsistencies in soft shadows, so implementing more granular shadow settings to suit player preference would perhaps not go amiss on PS5 and Series X. Lighting improvements were also touted in the lead up to version 7.0, with additional light sources being added and for more lights to be capable of casting shadows. Notice here how many tables and stools did not cast shadows before the version 7.0 update. It's hard to spot many upgrades in some locations, like the Kojin home of Tamamizu, while the atmosphere of other locations changes quite significantly. Some areas are lighter, others are darker, which may be cause for some debate, but on the whole, I'd say that the changes are positive and more likely to represent what the artist would have liked to have done in the beginning had the tools been available. While the lighting in the new version here makes it so that the guard in the foreground lacks a shadow, the structures behind him are lit much more dramatically, making it easier to discern their shape and form compared to the older, flatter lighting. Additional new lighting flourishes include backlighting shining through thinner parts of hair, and subsurface scattering, which is especially visible through pointed ears such as on Elezen characters. One of the star upgrades with version 7.0, the one that producer-director Naoki Yoshida said the development team was most excited about, is without a doubt the grass system. The old low-resolution alpha textures were ripped out game-wide and replaced completely with crisp-edged grass and flowers. In addition, touch bending, where grass and such reacts to character movement, is now implemented on all platforms, a feature that was sorely missed in Square Enix's own Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. In some places, especially where long flowers are scattered amongst the grass, the layout can feel a bit contrived, with overly patternized parallel arrangements, although the original implementation was often guilty of this as well. While grass is affected by shadows, it does not cast shadows. Grass density visibly changes as you move forward, and this can't be avoided even with the PC's highest setting for grass. It happens closer to the camera than I'd prefer, but I don't find it to be overly distracting most of the time. On PS5 and Series X, the draw volume of grass matches the highest setting on PC. Series S's reduced density is very noticeable in comparison, although taken on its own, with a view lower to the ground and behind the character, this level of grass detail is still satisfying enough, I think. PS4 is a match for Series S in terms of grass density and draw distance, but the dire state of the PS4 version's image quality after the graphics update gives grass and foliage a chunky, uneven, and speckled appearance. We'll address more about image quality in just a bit here. As has no doubt been obvious through comparisons up to this point, textures and shaders have seen extensive upgrades and alterations. Square Enix insisted that not everything would be updated in time for version 7.0, and while that is very much true, you'd be hard-pressed to find a spot in the game that isn't filled with higher frequency detail and new material properties. For instance, here in Lakeland, the stone to my right looks touched up and the ground texture looks significantly better. But the stone on the left side of the screen looks much the same as it did at a glance. Closer inspection shows a new detail texture on top. I don't think it really works that well here, but you'll now find this sort of thing all over the game world. Whether some of these textures are transitional assets that will then be replaced with more carefully crafted textures in the future remains to be seen. But on the whole, the upgrades are appreciated, akin to the differences you might expect from early screenshots to a finished, polished game. One thing I really like is how the scale of many ground textures has been adjusted to make more sense, and consequently look much sharper, like the stone pathways in Ilmeg. A similar thing was done outside Fano, where the glowing blue petals on the ground looked absolutely awful before. This is a huge improvement. I particularly like the look of this stone pillar in the Dravian Forelands. There is a little bit of a noise texture on top, but the base texture itself has been remastered in a way that is extremely faithful to the original, while looking much crisper and more realistic. The ground texture still doesn't hold up to close scrutiny, but it too looks better. It's a parallax occlusion map, and most of the world of Final Fantasy XIV is absolutely covered in them. Parallax occlusion maps allow flat textures to have perspective-correct depth, and while the trick always could and still does fall apart in certain scenarios when viewed at too sharp of an angle, it's long been one of my favorite parts of Final Fantasy XIV's technical makeup. It's rather unusual for a modern game to use parallax occlusion maps so gratuitously, so I enjoy that they give Final Fantasy XIV a unique visual signature. Some do look a little weird, like the ultra-coarse stone walls in Ul'dah, but nonetheless they've become much sharper with version 7.0, though it feels like there's too much depth here perhaps. A more subtle parallax occlusion map can be seen here in Kugane, where the blurry cobblestones have given way to a somewhat clearer version of the same effect. Most revamped parallax occlusion maps throughout the game have seen similar treatment. The depth effect is generally unchanged, but the asset has small resolution increases and/or detail texture on top. The extra detail can actually really shine, literally, when wet or when the light strikes at just the right angle. While the new Dawntrail zones were designed with a higher visual target in mind, texture work can still be as uneven as anywhere else in the game. The main pathways in Kozamauka immediately stood out to me as having obvious repetitious tiling and being a rare example of a ground texture with no depth. The grassy texture in Urkopacha also suffers from what looks to me like some over-sharpening. And the straw roofs, while normally far enough away from the camera to get a pass, ain't too pretty up close. But taken as a whole, viewed from a standard camera distance, I think the new zones come together as being quite attractive, and Urkopacha is already one of my favorites in the entire game. Some of the best parallax occlusion maps in FF14 to date are also in these zones. I am particularly fond of the stony ground texture seen throughout much of Urkopacha, and most especially of some of the wooden boards found in Okanu, which have such a convincing sense of depth above anything I've seen elsewhere in the game. So, while low-res textures haven't been completely stricken from the world-designed visual targets, I do think it's clear that the ceiling for texture quality has been raised as well. PS4 still has that setting where choosing normal instead of high flattens parallax occlusion maps and disables some reflections for a touch more performance. Funny enough, this setting has no visible impact in Dawntrail zones as far as I've seen, as the PS4 appears to disable parallax occlusion maps in the newest zones regardless of settings. But aside from PS4 being a bit limited in Dawntrail areas, all consoles seem to otherwise use the highest quality textures that are available on PC. The details can be harder to see on PS4 due to its upscaling, but get up close and you'll see they're still there. The devs really downplayed the extent to which the update would apply to PS4, as it too gets all of the high-resolution details like fine threads and cloth and the like. However, PS4 does now have to have low levels of detail enforced on distant objects, which was only optional before. By the way, texture filtering on consoles has been given a boost. Check this shot of Alamigo on PS5 from my pre-7.0 archives compared against a new clip. The game is set to 1440p in both, and the increase in clarity on the ground here is thanks not only to higher res textures, but also better texture filtering. Something else you can see in this shot is the rougher, less reflective metal strip on the ground. Throughout the game, you'll find many cases where material properties have been more clearly defined, and as a general rule, surfaces now tend to be less overly glossy. I think we're going to look back on the era of screen space reflections and decide it was all a big mistake, so I'm personally happy to see the effect become more subtle. Where reflections can still be clearly seen, the quality of the reflection is also nicely increased on all platforms. Really, so few surfaces are now reflective enough to see other players in them clearly, but a nice adjustment is that animations within reflections now update every frame. On every platform, including PC, animations other than your own within reflections used to update at laughably low rates. Now, even PS4 updates animations within reflections every frame that it does manage to draw. But reflections do still draw in and out far too noticeably at the edges of the screen for my liking, especially over bodies of water. At least the water shaders themselves have been considerably overhauled. The result is nothing groundbreaking or out of the ordinary, but I'd say that water does look better now, even if it's by just a bit. You've no doubt noticed that the most obvious shader improvements apply to metals. Some might even think that certain pieces of metal now look too polished. I'm not even sure I knew that some of this was supposed to be metal before the update, but personally, I really love it. Improvements to skin materials and how skin reacts to light was mentioned often during the lead up to version 7.0, with a particular emphasis on improving the rendering of darker skin shades. I had this cutscene recorded from the PS5 version in my archives, and this guy is a great example of why the old shaders were so bad for dark skin. Only with the new version can you actually see the shape of his face and body clearly. Beyond that, the various alterations to character models is probably the area where fans felt most compelled to give Square Enix feedback based on their 7.0 preview presentations, because people feel very attached to their characters, and any changes to appearances are a tough pill for some folks to swallow. To be honest, I may not really be the right person to weigh in on the results here, because if I were overly invested in appearances, I wouldn't be a Lalafell with a mustache. But sharper hair textures and additional polygons allocated to places like eyes, mouths, and ears apply to player characters and NPCs alike. I do suspect that fear over player backlash held the devs back from going as far as they could with this. For instance, visible texture in skin has only minimally increased. If you compare this to the more realistic skin in the game's various FMVs, I don't think it would be out of place to go further with these details, but large swaths of the community might not be ready to accept it. Nonetheless, faces have changed, and additional controls have been added for facial expression, which may have changed existing expressions. Take this random nobody from a Shadowbringers cutscene, who's just built with player character parts. His face looks a bit more boyish in the new version, I'd say. So if this was your character, would you consider this positive, negative, or would you just be indifferent? Then there's the guy next to him. He may now be lit better and have more detailed eyes, but his expression is fairly different, with the older, more dumbfounded look fitting the context of the scene better. Allra characters in particular have changed quite a bit, with altered luminance and limbal rings in their eyes, and much more detailed horns and scales. So now that we've had these updated characters for a little while now, is anyone still unsettled about the changes? Have you gotten used to it, or even learned to love it? Clothes are the other part of the community's vanity, and this I do like to have some fun with, although the updates here are still pretty scattershot. If we look at that Aura character again, it's pretty obvious that a lot of effort was put into making starting gear for each race look pretty crisp. The way some of these materials react to light is just fantastic, I think. In fact, the gear that I've gotten playing through Dawntrail so far is fine, I guess, but still isn't on the same level of material properties compared to starting gear. I even checked starting Lalafell gear just to make sure I wasn't fooled by detail being so shrunk down to my size or something, and no, Lalafell male starting gear has great detail too. My buddy here has level 100 Viper artifact armor. That's for one of the new jobs, and it definitely has some nice leathery and fabricy materials going on. Although maybe I'm crazy, but I still think some of the starting sets might have more impressive textures. Either way, for now at least, it seems Square Enix still has multiple tiers of quality, even among new equipment, and starting gear certainly gets the hero treatment. I've got this character equipped with gear that she earned from some early quests, and it looks much the same as it always has. Her pants in particular I think stand out like an undetailed sore thumb. There's still the odd splash of PS1 looking clothing textures on some stuff though, which has always been an amusing visual quirk of the game. I wonder if that will ever go away entirely. Main story characters have had many outfits touched up, and I suspect eventually they will all be updated, but it's still a work in progress. For instance, the winter clothes worn relatively briefly by the cast during Endwalker look much the same as they did in 2021. Most clothing updates are great, but I'm kinda bothered by what they did with the feathery bits on Ishtola's outfit that she's been wearing since Shadowbringers. Still needs work, I'd say. Naoki Yoshida noted during a presentation last year that the advancements in their material systems are also what has made the dual dye system for clothing possible, which has definitely been fun to play with, although I hope more pieces are added to this feature in time. Alright, I've been holding this one back for long enough. The new anti-aliasing and upscaling features for both PC and console are both exciting and strange. Previously, Final Fantasy XIV on PC only had two choices for anti-aliasing: off or FXAA, which does very little to reduce aliasing on jagged edges in motion, but it was still popular as a lightweight technique back when A Realm Reborn released. All these years later, two somewhat obscure anti-aliasing choices have been added: TSC-MAA and TSC-MAA plus camera jitter. TSC-MAA is a variant of Intel's CMAA technique, which, according to Intel's documentation, was itself designed as a successor to FXAA. TSC-MAA then adds a temporal element, and the results are interesting. But as we move forward here, keep in mind that tacking temporal anti-aliasing onto an older game is not necessarily a trivial thing, which is very likely the reason it's these techniques that were settled on. The basic coverage of TSC-MAA is somewhat similar to FXAA. For better or worse, it's a hair sharper, but the result is clearly less jagged compared to no anti-aliasing at all. What makes it different from FXAA is its temporal accumulation, allowing information from previous frames to inform the end result. Notice how the swaying bamboo leaves have a somewhat clearer, more stable form with TSC-MAA because they're moving, giving the algorithm temporal information to work with. It's not like amazing, but I think it's better than what was there before. So in short, I think it's easiest to think of TSC-MAA as being similar to FXAA when stationary, but with TAA on motion. Temporal anti-aliasing solutions usually have a camera jitter component that gathers information about adjacent pixels. Well, FF14's developers have rather unusually decided to make camera jitter a separate anti-aliasing option unto itself. As with more typical TAA solutions, this is how stationary or nearly motionless objects get their cleaner edges. But unlike the TAA you might be used to, the jitter is not invisible to the player, with various spots becoming prone to unpleasant flickering pixels. So it makes sense that this is a separate option, because I suspect very few players will prefer TSC MAA plus camera jitter, even though in parts of the scene where it works, it does work rather well. Temporal ghosting can be visible with either TSC MAA technique when moving the camera really quickly, but not in a way that I notice very often myself. So what do consoles do then? My first impression was that anti-aliasing appeared to be removed. But once I started moving, I see, so there is a TAA of a sort here. So weird as it seems, PS5 and Series X seem to be using what looks like the temporal component of TSC MAA, or something like it, but not the edge detection or camera jitter, making stationary objects appear devoid of anti-aliasing. Is this the intended behavior? Or are consoles supposed to have the full-fat TSC MAA? Because it does feel like a bit of a side grade from FXAA. Now we have decent anti-aliasing in motion, but essentially no AA at all when still. It really feels like just a mistake, and I'll be curious to see if this changes in the future, or if anti-aliasing options become selectable on consoles. Interestingly, Series S still uses FXAA, which creates an odd situation where, if set to 1440p, it has generally less stable image quality than PS5 and Series X when objects and the camera is in motion, but arguably better image quality than the premium consoles when things are relatively stationary. If TSC MAA were working correctly on PS5 and Series X as it does on PC, these jaggies would be treated similarly to how they are here on Series S. I will say though, playing on PS5 and Series X, sitting 8 feet back from my 65-inch screen with the game set to 1440p resolution, I find that I'm not thinking about the jaggies any more than I used to back in the game's FXAA days. So on the whole, I think the anti-aliasing situation is totally tolerable on the high-end consoles, but it's weird and could be better. On PC though, there is another key feature, and that is of course NVIDIA DLSS. If you choose DLSS, dynamic resolution is forced on and your options for anti-aliasing become unselectable. Other than choosing a frame rate threshold for when dynamic res kicks in, DLSS is just gonna do what it's gonna do. There's no DLSS quality or DLSS performance modes to choose from or anything like that. But on the whole, I think it's great. DLSS certainly attacks aliasing more comprehensively than any of the dedicated anti-aliasing techniques. Let's take a look at these coniferous trees. They're close enough to still sorta make out individual pine needles, but far enough away that it's difficult for the game's AA techniques to render them coherently. It shows both the strengths and weaknesses of TSC MAA plus camera jitter and DLSS in equal measure. TSC MAA plus camera jitter samples more information and thus the branches appear fuller than with the other techniques, but it's very flickery. Meanwhile, DLSS is by far the most stable visually, but the thinnest parts blend a bit into the sky, so none are a perfect solution. On PC, the graphics settings require you to choose an upscaling technique. There is no offsetting here, but in practice, FSR is off as long as the game is not rendering below the resolution it's set to run at. So if you don't want to see FSR, just keep the graphics scale at 100 and or set the frame rate threshold for 30 and you'll just get native resolution or whatever you set it for. Since DLSS obviously can't run on the console versions, all consoles also support FSR upscaling as of version 7.0, though unless you're on PS4, you're not likely to see it. On PS5 and Xbox, it can be easily avoided in much the same way as PC. Just keep dynamic resolution scaling disengaged, set your preferred fixed resolution, 1440p is absolutely the way to go on PS5 and Series X and 1080p for Series S, and then that resolution just gets passed through. Simple, clean, no upscaling artifacts. As has been the case since its introduction in version 6.2, the dynamic resolution scaling feature is still too slow to adjust in 7.0, and CPU constraints are often the cause of drops on any platform anyway, making its utility for maintaining frame rate very minimal. The base PS4 version has no resolution settings, no dynamic resolution settings, and no way to disable upscaling. It's gone from 1080p native with FXAA before version 7.0 to what pixel counting leads me to believe is a static 900p with FXAA, although dynamic resolution can't be ruled out. This is then given a sharpened FSR upscale to 1080p, and I can't say a single nice thing about it. It looks absolutely dreadful. You can make out a faint grid as an upscaling artifact across the whole screen, and you can't enjoy new features like the upgraded grass because it just becomes an incoherent, sparkly mess. I'd rather just have a soft 900p with no sharpening artifacts personally. If you're on PS4 Pro, then the situation is much better. Using the in-game 1080p setting appears to just be straight 1080p with FXAA, as it always was, no upscale. If you turn on the 1440p setting, then you get a sharpened upscale, which admittedly isn't nearly as bad as what happens to PS4, although I still find the sharpening to be suspect. 1440p tanks performance on PS4 Pro anyway, as it always has, so you should ignore this. So I guess that brings us, lastly, to new performance features. In a move that I honestly did not expect, version 7.0 launched with 120Hz support for PS5, Series X, and Series S. But first, real quick, if you're on PS5 or Series X and are just sticking with good old reliable 1440p at 60Hz, then the update hasn't overly upset the status quo. But that's not to say you might not get a stutter or two in old locations that you wouldn't expect. My first visit to Tuliyollal, which I didn't record, ran really poorly, but the crowds have thinned out a bit since then, and the city itself isn't that hard on either system. You might notice a hitch or two more while exploring the world than you used to. Kozamauka keeps tripping me up a bit, maybe related to hunt trains though. But I haven't really found any widespread sustained performance issues that tangibly make the experience worse than what we had before. And I do apologize that I don't have time to do thorough testing and instanced content right now, but generally that stuff has always ran well on consoles, and drops there are less noticeable compared to world traversal drops, in my opinion. As for the 120Hz mode, well, none of these consoles have any chance of maintaining 120 frames per second in this game. But nonetheless, it is an appreciated feature with some caveats. Firstly, due to capture logistics, I have to record 120Hz at 1080p, and can unfortunately only get frame rate data from Xbox in this situation. We can get an idea of how they compare from my TV's VRR data though, which suggests a very similar turnout. At the recommended resolution of 1440p, PS5 and Series X are generally turning in frame rates ranging from the 60s to 90s, and occasionally over 100. So within a fixed refresh rate of 120Hz, that's going to be a worse experience than the typically consistent 60 frames per second that you'd get with that resolution on these machines when the system is set to 60Hz. Even 1080p will have a hard time hitting and holding 120 frames per second. When VRR is in use though, high frame rate FF14 on consoles is pretty neat. I especially appreciate the increased motion clarity compared to 60Hz, and I have used this mode for a good chunk of my time playing through Dawntrail thus far, which has mostly been on PS5 and Series X. I'm a bit conflicted about all this though, because the old cap of 60 let you have a really great experience with Xbox's 120Hz VRR with low frame rate compensation. Now, 120Hz, even with VRR, is trying to fly too close to the sun. Fields generally feel smooth with high frame rate VRR, but towns are disappointingly stuttery in a way that they weren't back when the cap was 60. On PC, you can select a 60 frames per second cap, and I think there could be utility for that on consoles too. You know what though? They actually did add an optional cap for consoles, which I was also surprised to finally see appear. A 30 FPS cap. Now, I know that a lot of people really struggle with 30 FPS these days, but especially if you're on PS4, please give it an honest try. The frame pacing is blessedly even, making for a very consistent experience, which is not at all the case when playing unlocked on PS4, since it can only rarely hit 60 frames per second. But Limsa Lominsa, even early in the morning on a weekday with not that many folks in the game yet, can definitely bring the PS4 below 30. This is a feature I wanted back when I first started playing the console versions in 2014, and even though I don't actively play this version anymore, I hope some people do see the benefits of this feature. When the Xbox versions first launched earlier this year, I found Series S's performance at 1080p to be a bit worse than expected. Mostly 60 frames per second, but still, it had enough drops to be problematic. That's still the case, but now the game is even heavier. New zones even more so. I played the main story quests in the Yoctel region on Series S on a display without VRR, and reducing settings like physics and such still couldn't smooth things out enough. I couldn't find peace until I set it to 30 FPS, and then I had a grand old time. I admit, it is a big sacrifice when the game generally can do 60 FPS a lot of the time on Series S, especially in instances. But it's worth keeping an open mind and seeing if you can adapt to 30 for a more consistent experience. I apologize that I have neither the hardware nor the expertise to provide Alex-style optimized settings for PC players, but if you were here looking for that, hopefully you've found at least some insight that will help you make your own decisions about which features are most important to you, and which you're willing to compromise on in the name of performance. And yes, I know there are mods and community-made shaders, but that is well beyond the scope of what I've got time to get into right now. While there are issues, I do feel that the graphics update is overwhelmingly a positive development for the game. They didn't have to do it. Final Fantasy XI never got a graphics update, and I think that speaks volumes about how serious Square Enix is about keeping FF14 relevant long-term. While it's definitely been a challenge for me to jump from version to version to test and make comparisons and hope the weather and time of day didn't change too much in between, it's been great to see that the PS5 and Series X versions are virtually free from compromise against PC. Minor differences in anisotropic filtering, anti-aliasing, and an ambient occlusion setting that I personally chose to not use anyway are about all that separates them from PC. Other than performance potential, of course. PS4 and Series S players do have to accept some rather rough edges, but the main features of the graphical update are largely intact for them too. I'm also happy to say that the aggressive mandatory chat filtering that plagued Xbox for months after that version launched seems to have eased up significantly. It is still possible to trigger it with innocent conversation, but my experience so far suggests that the situation has improved enough that I now feel comfortable in recommending the Xbox version. Although the fact that the issue remains at all is worth consideration when choosing a platform. If I were to make a wish list of 5 technical priorities for Square Enix to address, I would say 1. Resolve the issues with soft shadow diffusion varying with camera angles. 2. Get TSC MAA working correctly on current gen consoles. 3. Do another pass over facial animations to ensure that legacy cutscenes don't have out-of-place expressions. 4. Please don't require FSR upscaling on any platform. And 5. Implement frame rate caps for use with 120Hz and VRR on current gen consoles. So like 40, 60, and an achievable target over 60, like maybe 80 FPS, could help minimize noticeable frame time variations for various resolution targets compared to the current unlocked implementation, while maximizing the utility of low frame rate compensation VRR. Alright, well, I've just gotten past some crazy plot twists in Dawntrail, and I think I'm about to unlock the 5th new zone, so I'm eager to get back to it. If you found this video useful or entertaining in any way, do the whole like, subscribe, and bell ringing thing both here on Digital Foundry and on my own channel, My Life in Gaming. And I'll see you in Tural, adventurers.